Hi everyone. I think we'll get started. A few people roll in late, that's okay. So just wanted to welcome you to Len Wood Middle. It's great to see people, parents in our gym. It's been a long time, so that's my heart. Good to see you all sitting here. Really excited for you to hear this presentation. We had Dr. Sean Larsen here with us today, and he's with us tomorrow, and he was speaking on sleep for our students today and the connection to anxiety. But your presentation is purely on anxiety, and I think it's going to be excellent. So I wanted to introduce Dr. Sean Larsen. He's come all the way from Roslyn, so a 4-hour drive. He came yesterday, and he's staying overnight again tonight. And I think you're going to be really impressed with his knowledge. And I wanted to just mention that the slideshow that you'll be watching, he's done all the art for it. So he's an artist as well as being his intelligent doctor. So without further ado, here's Mr. Larsen, Dr. Larsen.
Is it okay if I pull this off to talk into the mic? Because I'm not used to holding a mic. I probably thought I was going to make it through my whole life without doing something like this, but I don't know. Talking to people. And I actually only finished my PhD a few months ago, so when people introduced me as doctor, I was still like, oh man, I should correct them. I'm like, so it's still a bit weird for me. I'm getting used to it. It's okay for my distance, people can hear me. Cool. We're going to talk about supporting anxious kids tonight. So thanks everyone for coming out to talk about this. I had so much fun talking to your young people today. They were amazing. I was really impressed with all the groups that I was able to talk to. So here's what we're going to go through tonight. We're going to start by talking about just generally what we can get rid of all anxiety. And then we're going to talk about brains, because brains are really important when we talk about anxiety, especially understanding a developing brain and what's different about a child's brain to an adult brain can be really important in terms of how we help kids, especially as they're learning to manage and deal with anxiety in a different way. Talk a little bit about how anxiety works, when anxiety becomes problematic, and then we'll give 5 strategies for how to manage it. And then I'll talk about what do we do with meltdowns, or what do we do when kids freak out, because this is a really common thing related to anxiety, and I'll try to draw that link in pretty clearly for you of why kids freak out so much as it relates to anxiety. And then what do we do once kids are kind of over that point of being able to manage in that moment and create these somewhat nightmarish scenarios inside of homes, and how can we manage that in ways that are a little bit different. For kids, talk a bit about COVID and anxiety, postmodern anxiety. That's going to be stuff like video games and caffeine, pot, and how all of that can influence anxiety for kids as they grow. And then post-traumatic stress, and then briefly I'm going to talk to you about kids, because as it relates to anxiety, we do often hear a lot of talk, especially related to suicide. So we'll try to talk to you a little bit about how you can manage that in the home if it comes up. And it's one of those things that I know sometimes when you hear kids in suicide, automatically your heart starts beating really fast and it feels like it's going to be something uncomfortable. But based on current statistics, it's fairly common, as scary and as frightening as this is for kids and for adolescents to think about suicide at some point throughout their adolescence, and learning how to talk about it openly with them and how to assess is this actually a risk, or is this thinking, oh my gosh, the world is so overwhelming right now, I really wish I were not in this world, which is often the case. And often when kids say, oh man, I wish I weren't alive, and we go, and really they're saying, oh, it just sucks to be me now that I wish I didn't. But we'll talk about that as we go into it. So this is a question I asked to all the young people today, and it's a question I asked to most people that I speak to, but if I could give you a magic pill right now that could get rid of all of your anxiety, how many people think they would love that pill? But for the record, we don't have that pill. Like in psychology, there's no pill. It doesn't exist. But if I could give you that pill, do you think it would be something that you want? Right? And so when I asked that to the young people this morning, like a lot of hands went up. But you're more savvy than that. Some of you are probably like, I'm not going to say in this group that I would take that pill. But were somebody to advertise it on my Facebook later, I would probably So I want to talk about two examples of people with anxiety that I think are interesting and kind of answer this question for us. The first is somebody called patient SM. And patient SM was this woman in the States who was one of the only people that research has found really didn't have any anxiety. And the reason for this is because patient SM had a strange disease called Urbach-Weiss disease, which calcified a small part of her brain called her amygdala, which is like the size of an almond in the middle of your brain. And it's responsible for most of what we experience as anxiety. And so this part of her brain was destroyed. And so she didn't experience anxiety. And the lab would have been hilarious to work in because they just like constantly try to scare her. They'd sneak around like corners with like venomous snakes and like surprise her. Or they'd like bring her into these like abandoned insane asylum type environments and just really try to terrify this poor person and get a response from her. And then they recorded all the reactions and she didn't have a whole lot of reaction to all those things. So what do you think patient SM's life was like? Like, do you think she was like the personification of like a woman from a Dove commercial? Like just triumphantly emerging into the world? Like, what do you think? So her life was pretty rough. She was held at gunpoint 3 times in her life, which, like, maybe that's a normal thing in like Florida, but like when I read it, I was like, that's ridiculous. And part of that is because anxiety is so important to us. And anxiety helps us navigate the world, to recognize the risks in the world around us, to know what's important, to move towards things that are good for us, and to move away from things that are bad from us. And I think patient SM's story, it's a really interesting thing to Google. I highly recommend it, patient SM. And I know you got kind of the worksheet that I created for the kiddos before we swapped it over to sleep for them, but you're also welcome to these slides. I'm happy to email them out and you can have copies of them. But her life was really tough. Lots of accidents, lots of abusive relationships throughout her life. Lots of being taken advantage of by people, which is exactly why she's now known as patient SM, and she's lived under the care of others since they realized that she didn't have anxiety, right? Could you imagine? Because they did this research on her before, like, they had Facebook. Could you imagine her, like, navigating social media or, like, all these, like, internet email scams these days? Like, it would be a nightmare if you didn't have that little piece in your brain that says, like, hey, they're not a prince. Like, it would be really rough to not have anxiety. And so I think that's a really important example because when we talk about anxiety, right, it's often about where is anxiety going wrong for us. So when I first probably asked you, would you take a pill to get rid of all your anxiety? You probably thought of all those places where anxiety makes your life harder or your kids' lives harder, because that's how the world often talks about anxiety. We often forget that that's the outer edge of what anxiety is. Anxiety is actually really good for us. We need anxiety. Anxiety is awesome. And I don't say that as somebody who's been super confident through my whole life and never had to worry about typical fears. I say that as someone who was diagnosed with OCD when I was a kid and struggled with really severe anxiety through most of my life that didn't get in the way. So when I say that quite honestly, that anxiety is awesome. And it's awesome for our kids, but there are definitely places where it can start to get in the way. So the other example I want to bring up is Alex Honnold. Anyone know this name? Anyone familiar with rock climbing? He's a free climber. Alex Honnold, there's a couple of documentaries that he's part of. And one of them chronicles the picture that you see, which is free climb of El Capitan, where he climbed out with no ropes, right? And that's like 3,000 meters above the ground, and not an easy route, like a route that a lot of rock climbers, like, that's a pretty dang hard route. Like one false move and his life was over. And so just before this documentary of him doing this came out, he had been touring with another documentary called, what was it? I can't remember, but it was when he did the Half Dome climb. And there were some neuroscientists in the crowd at one of his talks. He did a TED talk on it. And they were like, man, we got to study this guy's brain because there's something different. Because it's super weird that he can do that without anxiety, changing the way his body works and making it probably fatal for him. Like most people would freeze up at some point and be like, well, too much, and then just have a hard time continuing up that wall. But for some reason he didn't. And so what they did was they they took a bunch of scans of his brain, and they totally expected him to be like another patient. That's what they were thinking, was that part of his brain was broken. But what they found out was actually that he had quite a functional amygdala. So his brain worked normally. However, when it related to rock climbing, it didn't seem to show that same fear. And so they asked him about it, and they're like, well, related to relationships, to money, to other stresses in life, your brain is working pretty typically when we look at these scenarios. But when it relates to rock climbing, it doesn't seem like you're having that same response. And you can see the brain scan there between him and another rock climber, who's also somebody who searches out frightening situations, because there's different types of brains. So they tried to find somebody similar who also searched out exciting situations and was another professional rock climber. And that's him talking about difficult climbs, and that's what his brain looks like. Whereas you see the other rock climber, right where that cross hits, it's lit up red like a light bulb, whereas with Alex Honnold, right where that cross hits, there's nothing. Like, it's totally flat. And so what Alex Honnold said was that he started on climbs that were pretty easy for him, and he kept a journal, and he just climbed them thousands of times, over and over and over again. He'd climb them to the point where he'd start to feel afraid, and then he'd do it again, and then he'd do it again, and then he got bigger and bigger and bigger, over thousands and thousands and thousands of repetitions, so he eventually, essentially, trained his anxiety to not influence how he was climbing. Was it a smart move? Time will tell. I mean, he's making a lot of money, and he's got a really cool camera bit. But I don't know if I still want to go up one of those massive climbs without a brain that's like, hey, Sean, this could go dramatically wrong at any moment here. Like, maybe you shouldn't be up for here, or at least have a rope, right? So, kids are snowflakes. And I had this slide years ago before any political rhetoric was attached to this term. And what I meant by it was that as we move through this presentation, as I talk about kids and brains and anxiety, I want you to keep in mind that in some ways, all kids are like other kids. In other ways, some kids are like some other kids. And in other ways, the child you're thinking about is just kind of like the child you're thinking. And so there are places where everybody is similar, but there are also places where kids really differ. And so with all of these strategies, there's no one-size-fits-all for all kids. And trying out different strategies with different kids sometimes takes a little bit of wiggling and figuring out exactly what works for the child that you're thinking about. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. I've been working with kids and anxiety for nearly 2 decades now, and I'm constantly surprised and constantly having to rethink game plans with families of like, oh, okay, I guess that's not going to work, so try something different. And that's okay, that's part of learning, and I think that's part of parenting and that's part of caregiving, is understanding what's going to work best for your child. So, what is anxiety? Anxiety is an emotion. And I think as a society, we tend not to be very good at emotions, right? Hence I get phone calls and messages from parents all the time that say things like, hey, my child is sad, and you need to get rid of the sadness. Or my child is anxious, I need you to get rid of the anxiety from them. It seems like with all emotions, we kind of see them as things that often get in the way rather than what they actually are, which is this wonderful system we have in our brain that helps us interact with the world better. And all emotions have a point. All emotions are trying to push us towards things that are good for us and keep us away from things that are bad for us, right? Like, you think of sadness, like sadness sucks. It sucks to feel sad about stuff. But the reason we feel sad is so that we value the things that we have. When we lose something, and this is where sadness often comes in, when we've lost something that's rewarding to us, we feel sad as a result of that. And then that drives us to, one, put value on the things that we have, and two, continue to seek out those things of value, because we know how it feels to lose them, right? Or when we feel anger. Anger is an interesting one, and we'll talk about this a lot more because it relates a lot to anxiety, but I feel like most of our psychology programs in anger have totally missed the mark because anger volcanoes or whatever, so I think about these programs. But anger is one where anger is one of these feelings where it does a lot of good for us in the right context, right? Anger energizes you to deal with something that's either hurt you or could potentially hurt you, right? This is where anxiety comes in. Anger is an energizing emotion, right? So if you're cruising down the highway in your minivan and you've shamefully memorize the words to the Adele song and you're singing along and somebody cuts you off, and all of a sudden your brain, which has been around for 250,000 years, and without you even knowing, is a little unsure about you traveling down a highway at that speed. All of a sudden it's now cut off, and your brain sees that car in front of you as a threat and says, kill that freaking person, right? And these are where, like, you see these videos on YouTube of, like, dads getting out of the van with their Birkenstocks and throwing their first awkward punch, which looks so strange because you've got this primal system in you that's like, grr, right? This is, I do a lot of work with fatherhood. That's what my PhD research was in, and I talk to a lot of men about emotion, a lot of men about anger. And they talk about, because one of the most emotional things for men that they're not used to, we're used to kind of looking out for ourselves, and you become a father, and all of a sudden now you're worried about somebody else. And so when something threatens your kid, or like if you've got two kids and one of them hurts the other kid, you're like, and you don't know how to manage that in the moment, because that's what anger is designed for, right? It's to energize you to deal with something that's a potential threat. So emotions are really good. So is anxiety. Anxiety is great. We just need to learn to manage them a little bit differently. So I'm going to jump in a bit here to talk about brains. We're obviously not going to be able to cover everything about brains. There's a lot to them. But I want to cover enough so that you can know how to help kids specifically, because their brains are really different than ours. Brains, one of the most common metaphors for brains is that they're like muscles, right? We talk about brains as we build them like muscles. But if brains were a lot more like muscles, what would happen is you'd essentially start out looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then over time kind of wither into something that looks like me, because brains, what they do is they give you way more material than you might use, and then what you actually use is the stuff that ends up sticking around. And so the most dense your brain is ever going to be is at about the age of 12. And this is really an important thing to remember, because brains organize and develop through time based on what they're using and what they're doing. And it's not, this is why it's not so much that you can be like, well, I taught him that, I told him that, he should know. Like, that's not how kids' brains learn. Kids' brains learn through pattern repetitive experience over and over and over again. I look at brain development a bit like establishing a city amongst a field of tall grass, right? Initially, there's going to be pathways everywhere across that field. And then over time, people start figuring out the main places that they're actually going in that town. They start wearing through these stronger dirt pathways. And you start putting an infrastructure around that, which can be seen as the regions of the brain. It helps you get from here to here to here to here over time. And those pathways start to become more prominent. And then eventually over time, you're like, well, those are the ones we're going to use, so we should pave them. But imagine now you've got a pathway that's laid down, and you realize you'd really prefer people didn't walk on it. But you can't just blast a new pathway through, because your old pathway was worn in by walking. Right? And so this is kind of what happens when we try to change the way a child behaves based on their brain development, is we're asking them essentially to start walking through the long grass. And so this is why at first, it's really awkward when we get kids to do things that are new to them, especially when it relates to these primal emotions. And this is also why when they're really stressed, like if you were walking home in the dark or it was raining, would you stick with the path that's really well laid out, or would you be like, oh yeah, I should be going through this long grass through the forest here. This is the path I've been working on because I think it's more efficient. Chances are you still run that same old path, which is why when kids are upset or stressed, and when we're upset or stressed, we don't do the thing that we think we should do. We do the thing that's comfortable and we done a whole bunch, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit more too. But I think that's a really important thing to learn about children and their brains, is that that's how the development looks like. It looks like constant use, and when we're trying to get kids to do something like overcome anxiety, it's not a, I'm going to tell you not to be scared of that thing, and all of a sudden we're not scared of that thing. It's a, we need to get you to walk a different path enough, and it's going to be hard for a little bit. But once we walk that path enough with you, it should start to get a little bit easier. It just takes time. Does that make sense? The little picture on the bottom was really interesting to me. That shows the synaptic density in a brain. Can you see that one? The little tiny one. It's kind of funny because that's like how kids act, isn't it? Like you remember having a 2-year-old around, it's just this chaotic, like, oh, you went from spastic to you want cake. Okay, cool, let's do this. That's just how their brains work. Whereas, you know, as they get older, you can look at ones online of adolescents' brains, as it starts to get a lot cleaner in terms of those connections as they get older. And then a really interesting thing happens in adolescence called myelination, which is, it's like the paving of the highways, so to speak. It's this fatty coating that goes over the synapses and speeds up that electrical flow through those synapses like up to 100 times. So it really changes certain things for them. This is, if you've ever heard people talk about executive functioning, which I know is a new hot topic for parents probably, but executive functioning is one of those things that like myelination of the prefrontal cortex is kind of a really big deal, and why kids start to be better, to get better at things like predicting what the future looks like. So what does it mean about the brain of a child? It means the brain of the child is really in the moment, has a really poor time travel, that's the term I use for it, has limited regulation, poor planning, intense emotional experiences, constantly developing. My favorite experience to illustrate this was, I got a call. The call was made on a Sunday night, but I listened to the message on a Monday. And over the phone, I hear this family like screaming and stuff smashing, and it was absolute chaos. They're like, I don't know what's happening, John, we need to meet with you right away. And so I bring them in to my office the next day, and we're sitting down talking about it, and at the epicenter of all this chaos is this cute little like 9-year-old. And I was like, man, what happened last night? He pauses and he takes a breath and he goes, I made chicken. I don't usually like chicken. That was really good. What did you put on that chicken? And they're doing what like most parents do in my office, which is like, well, bud, Sean's sick. He's here to help. You need to tell him what you're feeling so he can help you. And he's like, yeah, but like, what was on that chicken? I'm like, don't you remember when we were like scared for Dad's life? You know, swinging the hockey stick? But he had a really hard time moving off of this chicken, right? And this, it sounds crazy, right? Because you can just imagine this house is torn up and the parents are absolutely flabbergasted. They're like, how do you not know that that was the thing we were talking about? Like, the house is destroyed. But I'm sure all of you with kids have had this like same experience with kids. In a small version, you get it every time they come home from school, don't you? And you're like, hey, how was your day? Like, you don't get like a chronological list of events that happen throughout their day. You typically, especially for younger kids, it's like they've got this bucket of marbles, and they shake up this bucket of marbles, and then they grab a marble out of that bucket, and it's hard for them to move off of it. They're like, so-and-so was mean to me on the park today. And you're like, oh, surely you did other stuff than that. And they're like, I don't know why he was so mean. He's been really mean lately. I hate that guy. And then the whole world is flavored by this one marble that they pulled out. And that speaks a lot to how kids' brains work. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Anyone seen this with their kids? And that's kind of actually how the brain works, is because it's not myelinated yet and that time traveling piece isn't there. When we ask kids to go back and recall a moment that's not the current moment, it takes a fair bit of work. So they're not going to move through memories that clearly. They're kind of going to stick to one thing. And this is also what makes doing trauma work with kids hard, in that trying to pull it out from them in that moment, like especially when they're in my office, is really challenging. And oftentimes it just, that marble shakes up at the strangest times, and the parents are like, they're ready to talk about it. We had the craziest talking to the internet tonight. But no, that was just a moment. And that's with kids, like oftentimes you got to take advantage of when they've got those specific marbles in their hands, because you don't know how long they're going to hold. As they get older, it gets a little bit easier for them to kind of shuffle through the Rolodex a bit better, like especially in their adolescent years. But for little kids, it's really challenging. When we move into teenagers, there's a few different things going on there. They still have this core planning piece, right? This has to do with the prefrontal cortex. But they've got a little bit of added gasoline to that fire, and the teenage years across all species are a time of defining yourself and taking some risk. Like, in all species, you have to take some risk to figure out who you are in the world. And this is why teenagers are so drawn to all the risky things, and their brains reward them for it. Like when we talk about drugs, sex, all of this stuff, teenage brains are like, that's what I'm interested in exploring. For parents, it's really hard, but that's just what they're pushed towards, because risk is going to be necessary. If you're a little bird trying to get out of the nest, you got to risk it to fly, right? And in teenagers, that's overwhelmingly a huge experience for them. Teenagers also have this shift in terms of what's valuable to them, and that when they're little, what's valuable is making sure they're connected to their folks. And then, like, kind of between those years of like 7 to 11, they're super interested in like both what's going on in the family, and now they're kind of starting to look at stuff outside the family. But then they get this huge shift right around adolescence, where, like, if I was sitting around at the Flying Steam Shuttle, which is the bar in Roslyn with my friends, and I was like, hey guys, why don't we take a second and all rank each other based on popularity? All of my friends would be like, this is why we don't invite you anywhere, Sean. That's a really stupid thing. But if I were to ask any teenager who comes into my office, hey, why don't we rank everyone in your school by popularity? Do you think we could come up with a weird list like that? Most of them would be like, yeah, I can do that list. Let's get going. And there'd be some kind of like a drive to get them to do that list, because teenagers want to be valuable to society. They want to matter to the world around them. And that's a really cool thing to want to be valuable to the world around you. But it flies into their lives like this freight train just out of control in adolescence and takes over everything. And like every moment it feels like they're on performance, because they're constantly running through this ranking system in their brain, right? And like to embarrass a teenager in front of their friends is horrific. Like, I don't know if any of you remember your adolescence, but that's what it was like. Like, as soon as you get dropped off at the high school, it's like, don't say a word, let me get out of this car and do my thing. And then you're on performance, acting ridiculous. Like, as an adult, you look at them and you're like, oh my gosh. But for them, it's so important. And this is a huge deal when we talk about teenagers and anxiety, because so much of the anxiety teenagers experience and what can be so crushing for them is related to this huge inflated ranking system that they're constantly experiencing, which is obviously made harder in the modern world, because back in the day, I could go home and just sit down on the couch and get chirped to my siblings, and it just didn't matter. Teenagers don't really have that luxury anymore. It's always online, and when you look at what they're doing online, is literally ranking each other, right? It's crazy the way that social media is just so fit for that aspect of their brain development, and I think it creates so many challenges for teenagers. The other thing about teenage brains is that they've got fragile sleep routines. So I mentioned this to the young people this morning, that in the next few years, their sleep is going to get a lot harder for them. In that we know that across the world, all groups of teenagers, their sleep schedule, something we call a circadian rhythm, this clock inside the brain, it moves back about 2 hours. So teenagers' brains are programmed to go to bed about 2 hours later than your brains are, which is tough because they also want to sleep in 2 hours later, but they can't, because the world isn't designed to work for teenagers. It's designed to work for adults and kids. It's really unfortunate. And this is also why a lot of countries now are debating moving start times back for high school students. It's because it's very hard for them to focus really early in the morning. But the problem is, if you're not sleeping enough, your anxieties go way up. If somebody wanted to give me a cruel experiment where I just created anxiety in kids, literally all I would need to do is get rid of their sleep, and their anxiety would just spike right away. We know that teenagers aren't. So part of it is that their circadian rhythms lag and are different from the world, and the other part is that teenagers are just constantly looking for excitement. They have a hard time with healthy sleep routines and making good choices around that, so their sleep tends to suck. Anyways, the average time it takes a teenager to fall asleep is between 30 and 90 minutes. That's a long time to not sleeping. So that's something that really impacts anxiety as it relates to teenagers. So let's talk about the F words of anxiety. Does anyone want to yell out the F words? I'm just kidding. Growing up religious and thinking it's funny still. But the F words that I'm talking about are these ones. So freeze, flight, or fight. And I put them in this order specifically. I know when I first put this slide together, my daughter was like, yeah, it's fight, flight, or freeze. And I'm like, but I think I got a handle on this. But she was pretty sure. So I've reorganized them, because these are often talked about as though they're like multiple tools that we have in the toolbox. Some people pull out different ones or whatever, but what these actually are is they're a hierarchical way in which we respond to stress. And all people do it. So if you imagine a scenario in which you've got a cat and a rat, the very first thing that happens when that cat senses the rat in the room, it's going to stop moving. It's going to freeze. And it's going to do that because that is the least biological cost for it. It doesn't cost it anything to just stop moving. And maybe the cat won't see it. Maybe this isn't a problem. right? This is exactly like when you've got a 7-year-old playing Lego at the table and it's time to go to school, and you tell that 7-year-old, hey, we're headed out the door in 5 minutes. What's the first thing that they do? Pretend you didn't say anything. They just keep playing with the Lego because their brain's like, maybe this won't be a problem. I don't move. Right? And then the cat comes around the corner and makes eye contact with the rat, and the rat's like, oh crap, I'm gonna have to deal with this. The next least biological cost is running away. That's gonna take some energy, there's some risk of getting hurt as you're running away, but at least you don't have to deal with the thing that's a big stress. So this would be the point in that 7-year-old's experience where they're like, can I just, 5 more minutes, let me just play for 5 more minutes, just let me finish the thing that you don't understand, I'm just finishing this one tower, okay, I'll just finish this one tower, just give me 5 more minutes to finish this. Like, or what, I have to go to school every day, what if I just didn't go this day? You always work, can we just take a day where you don't work and you can stay home and then you don't want to go to school? Right, this is that second part where they're looking for a way out of the thing. Right, and then the cat moves towards it, there's no escape, it feels trapped. This is the part where your kid is like, fair game, Mom, I tried, you win, let's go to school. Thank you for your wonderful decision making and parenting, I appreciate you. I love you, Mom. And then you walk out and everyone's happy, right? No, this is for the rat. This is where like it could be the hippiest of all rats and never wants to hurt the thing. This is where its brain goes, I'm gonna mess up the cat. Like, because it has to, right? It changes so that it becomes aggressive to fight its way out of the thing that could potentially be a problem for it. And this is also what we see with kids. Whenever we push kids into a situation where they feel stuck to have to face their anxiety, whether it's around bedtime, whether it's around going to school, you can probably see all 3 of these things, right? Where they get to the point where they like throw their bag at the door and they're like, oh, I hate school, I have to go to school. And like if that's their fight, it's pretty mild. But for some kids, you see a little bit more than that, especially if it's say around going to bed or getting off electronics or whatever it is. If you're pushing them towards something that they feel a little concerned that they'd rather not do it, you're probably going to see most of these things. Is that crazy talk, or is everyone looking at experiences with their kids right now and doing like, yeah, pretty much sums up every experience I've had with them ever, right? So, I have to move over and touch this. I really like this video, just to demonstrate a little bit about anxiety and how the brain works. You probably won't be able to hear the sound.
Wait, Tara, are you going trick-or-treating? No, probably.
I just love what this video demonstrates. Now that you've gotten the shock out of your system from it, I want you to watch it again. What I want you to do is pay attention to Tyrone's body language. Because as someone who's worked in mental health, I've dealt with situations like this a bazillion times. Like I'll get a call from a school that'll be like, hey, this kid hit, bit, chipped, threw something, stabbed another kid with a pencil, yada, 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 down the list. They can't do that. We've told them a million times they can't do that. We send them into you, and you can also tell them not to do that, but you have some special magic where they're now going to stop doing it once you've told them not to do that. But watch Tyrone's body.
Wait, Tara, are you going trick-or-treating? No, probably.
So does he look like somebody here who's weighed the moral consequences of his decision and chosen a amoral action? Like at what point in that whole scenario was he making a bad choice, so to speak? Like where did the bad choice come in? It's a really hard one to see because when you look at his body, as he's backing up, it looks like he's in more shock than anyone else at what's just happened, right? Because when you look at his brain moving through those efforts to fight, it happened so fast that he could barely, like there's barely, I don't think there is a spot in there where he could have derailed that train. It happened so fast for him, right? Like guarantee if I sat down with Tyrone, I'd be like, hey Tyrone, how's it going? What are your general thoughts on punching people in the halls at school? You go, oh yeah, I probably totally shouldn't do it. I'd be like, cool, can you go forth from my magic counselor office and never punch another kid in school? You'd be like, oh yeah, for sure, man, thank you. And then you'd go to school, what would happen the next time somebody jumped out of a garbage can? Would you be like, oh yeah, Sean said not to punch people, I shouldn't punch people. Probably respond in that same way. And if you'd respond in that same way, because of those pathways in the brain that we talked about, that was a pathway in Tyrone's brain. And who knows why it fired that way? Who knows why it went straight to punching? There are a lot of situations where Tyrone's decisive body decision, I'll call it in there, would have saved his life or would have got him out of a dangerous situation. Right? There are a lot of places where that's a really reasonable response to somebody jumping out and potentially trying to cause you harm. In a school hallway, it's not one of them. And so I think it's a really important thing to look at and pay attention and think about when we do these things with kids that we often do of like, just need to make better decisions, man. Like absolutely, within their lives, there are a lot of places where they're making good and bad choices. We also have to be aware of how powerful that brain can influence kids, and that the way that they're acting when they're freaking out is dramatically influenced by that anxiety that they're experiencing. Does that make sense? So I want to give you an example of a way to put yourself in that scenario. So this is from a situation that happened to me in my early 20s. So I was out hiking with my dad. We're in upper Kananaskis country, and my dad, he was, still kind of is, a mountain climber. He was always incredibly fit. And I had a very hard time keeping up with him when I was really little. And so I was hiking with him in my 20s. I just come back from playing rugby overseas for a few years. I was feeling really fit, and I was pretty far ahead of him, and feeling really proud of myself. And then I came around this corner, and there was this huge sow grizzly. And the second that she saw me, she charged in and stopped within a few feet of me, started kicking the dirt and making this whooping sound, like within just a couple feet of me. So I want you to imagine you're in my hiking boots in this scenario, and imagine what would be going on in your body. What would be happening in your body were you in this scenario? What do you think you feel? Your heart would probably be beating like right through your chest, right? Where would your breath be? How would you be breathing? Without knowing, a lot of you would be breathing really quickly and shallow. You might feel really tingly and numb in your hands if you were hiking with like a super weird person who was like, this is an amazing experience. I really need you to draw it for me. No matter how good of an artist you would be, or you were, you couldn't draw in that situation, right? This is like for people who have tried to play music in front of people without ever having practiced playing music in front of people, and you get in front of people and you're like, whose hands are these? Like, they just don't work. Because body works differently when you're freaking out, right? Some people feel like they want to puke, some people do puke, some people feel like they want to pee, some people do pee at that moment. There's a lot that changes in our bodies. Some people feel really hot and warm in their hands, some people feel really cold in their hands. But there's huge shifts in our body related to anxiety. And this is important to pay attention to because when we're talking about anxiety, we're often saying, change the way you think about that thing. And we're forgetting that this is a whole body changing. The heart speeds up, hormones are released into the body's preparing itself to do some stuff. It's preparing itself to do those efforts, to run away from the thing, to fight the thing, and those are going to need major muscle groups. They're going to need you to be really strong in certain ways, and they're not going to need other things like fine motor coordination, right? So all this is happening. What about in the brain? What would happen in your brain in that moment? Let's say somebody was like, hey, do you remember so-and-so's phone number? I should call them and tell them it's there. How easily do you think you could remember that phone number? It'd be pretty hard in that moment to remember anything, right? What if you've got, what if you're hiking with somebody who happens, this is a great example for parents, but what if you happen to be hiking with somebody who's like a bear expert? So growing up, the bear expert I think of was this guy named Steve Guerrero, who chronicled like all bear attacks across North America. So let's say you're hiking with Steve and you're in this situation. But Steve's trying to be super helpful. So he starts talking to you, right? He starts saying stuff like, hey, Sean, can you tell me what it is you are afraid of on the bear? How do you think you'd respond to Steve in that moment? Most people would be like, stop. Like, you'd probably barely get out of words. You'd be like, shut up. And then what would happen if Steve responded back to me, he's like, okay, you know what, Sean, if you're going to talk to me like that, I am not going to hike with you again. How would you respond to Steve if he said that? You'd be like, I don't ever want to hike with you again anyways. I hate hiking. I'm never hiking again. I hate you. This is the worst. Because that's what you'd be feeling in that moment. Is anyone flashing back to conversations with their kids while they're anxious right now? Do kids respond like that to you sometimes? Yeah, because that's how the brain works in that moment. Let's say Steve was like a hugger. He's like, somebody needs a hug. Like, how would you respond if he came in and tried to close you in that space? Probably not very well. Push him off and you need space from him at that moment. The brain and body change dramatically in moments of stress. And I want you to think back to that bear analogy next time you're working with your kid around something that makes them anxious, because I think it's really relevant to try to understand what it feels like to be in that position. We have kids all the time. Like, I know as a parent, sometimes you're desperately hoping you still have control of the ship. And so you're trying to find that one thing that will get them to change their course, even just a little bit. Like, you're thinking in your head, like, what can I take away that will stop this moment from continuing? My gosh. And you're like, fine, keep it up and you don't get your phone tomorrow or whatever. And they're like, fine, take away my phone. And you're like, what? You love your phone. This is ridiculous. And you end up in these crazy punishment scenarios sometimes where, like, you know, you go to bed and talk to your partner, you're like, I think we're going to have to change religions because I canceled Christmas. So I feel really uncomfortable with it, but I also don't want to be inconsistent, so if we found out Judaism. Like, I kind of joke about that, but I've also had parents come into my office and they're like, well, not getting his Xbox back till June, and it's like February. And I'm like, what? At what point are they constantly reflecting on that moment? Like, do you remember when you were a young person and you got stuff taken away? Like, every time you thought about it later, where you're like, yeah, I should have been better in that one moment where it got taken away. Like, probably not. I mean, because again, kids' brains don't work that far in advance. We want punishments usually to be short, really specific, and give them opportunities to practice again pretty quick. Yeah, any thoughts or questions about that? Is that a helpful metaphor for understanding? So what happened in my scenario was that the bear's cubs ran by back on the trail where she first was, and luckily she turned around and followed them into the bush, kind of leaving me there, which is another interesting point to talk about related to anxiety, because how long do you think it was after I had this experience with the bear that my brain kind of went back to what I call normal? Like, this would have been maybe one of 2 or 3 experiences in my life where I quickly flashed through stuff and I'm like, I don't know if we're going to get out of this one. Like, I think the outcome here might be death. Like, this might kind of be it. And so that happened at about 11 in the morning, and I can still remember at like 5 sitting in a pub in Banff with my dad, and finally I can kind of laugh about it. Like, you get to that place where you feel the adrenaline dump out of your body, and you're like, oh man, that was crazy. But before that, I was probably pretty irritable. I was probably just pretty fixed state on stuff, a little bit numb in terms of how I was responding to the world, probably a little bit jumpy if something else happened. And so that's an important thing to remember too, especially when we talk about kids and their arousal systems, is that it's a whole physiological shift in the body, and it takes time to help kids out of those places. And this is going to be the how do we manage freak out. Talk about that. So tons of different stuff happens in the body. We talked about a lot of that. Tons of stuff happens in the brain, memory, all that becomes really hard. It's interesting when you look at so much of the behaviors that we see from kids that are problematic and put through this lens of anxiety, right? Like, you think about, say, for example, a kid who's really been studying hard for a test but hasn't been doing that well in school lately. They're really worried because they're noticing they're starting to fall behind. They're a little scared. They sit down to write this test. The first question is worded a little bit wrong. All of a sudden, their brain starts freaking out. They start forgetting everything they've memorized and spent so much time working for because they're so nervous. And then you've got a kid in front of them who, to manage their stress, is tapping their foot against the side of the chair constantly. And for that kid, that just starts to sound like a jackhammer, louder and louder in their brain. And they start to freak out, and they end up spazzing at the kid in front of them and getting class. Like, it sounds like a crazy scenario, but I hear stuff like that all the time. And to other people, it's like, he wasn't doing anything. I was watching him. It's like, he was, right? And you feel so justified when your brain, like, if you were to ask Tyrone, like, why did there's no way you could get him to look at his behavior, because he'd be like, no, he jumped out and I punched him. Like, that's the way it goes, because your brain is driven, it's told you essentially to do it, and it kind of sticks to the plan. With kids, you're like, am I really being a psychopath? But oftentimes it's more just, they saw it a certain way because of how their body was feeling towards that person. And these are also those scenarios where kids are like, stop yelling at me. And you're like, dude, there's one person yelling in this room, and it has never been me. Right? Like everything you say to kids, they take as like threatening and you're over the top. And that's part of that aggressive brain related to the body. Does that make sense? To fit people's experience a tiny bit? Okay. Let's talk really quickly about emotion and arousal. They're slightly different things, and I think they're really important to understand. When we talk about what happened with Tyrone, I would say it's more related to this arousal system. And when we talk about a lot of anxiety for kids, I think it's more related to arousal than we often think. When I use arousal, what I'm talking about is central nervous system arousal. Essentially, there's an engine inside all of us that ramps up and slows down depending on what we're doing. An easy example of it is imagine kids on the way home from a birthday party. At the birthday party, they've been loving life. They've been running around with their friends. They've been given copious amounts of sugar. And now parents do this thing, I think, where there's this competitive gift bags, where gift bags seem to be getting bigger and bigger when kids leave a party. They used to think going to the party was good enough. But now there's this thing where kids come home and they're rummaging through their gift bags. I don't know if you guys experience that, but I've seen that a lot. And so kids are rummaging through their gift bags and they pull out some massive thing of sugar. And while they're super ramped up, they're like, hey, oh man, I've always wanted one of these. It looks so good. I'm totally going to eat it. And then as a responsible parent, you're like, hey, it's 4 o'clock and we kind of got dinner done, so you're not eating that now. How do kids respond to you in that moment? Like, is it a rational response? It's usually that energy that's ramped up to a 10 and was just fine when they were cruising down excitement lane. You've now gotten away with something, and all of that energy spins to you. And worst parent ever, you never let me do anything, and this is the worst, right? This is also exactly what happens related to digital media, right? Because I hear from, and I'll talk about this more, but I hear from parents all the time, oh, it helps calm them down. Digital media does not calm kids down. It ramps them up. If we were to measure their skin temperature and heart rates while they're using digital media, it would be slowly accelerating. It would be the foot slowly on the gas and ramping up. So when you've had a kid who's on digital media for an hour and then you take them off of digital media, you kick them off because it's time to go to the dinner table, what kind of a response do you get from them? You get this chaotic, all this 10 out of 10 energy now has nowhere to go, and oftentimes it'll go to the person who made them shut off the game because they were so close to getting 50 joules or 50 points, or they needed to spend their V-Bucks or whatever it is. You are now the enemy and they're angry at you and they got nowhere else for them to go. Fair enough? People have seen that? So arousal is a really important thing to understand when we talk about anxiety, because emotion is essentially the direction that they're going, and arousal is the energy that's behind it. And so sometimes anxiety is related to they're just going in the wrong direction with it, but oftentimes what's happening is that their response is too powerful, and the way that we usually manage that easiest with kids is by helping them learn to manage arousal better, learn to speed up and slow that system down a little bit. So when is anxiety problematic? Anxiety is problematic when it gets in the way of things that people should be doing. So for kids, this is usually stuff like going to school or going to sports or doing stuff that's good for them, or stuff that they used to enjoy or that they might still enjoy, but anxiety is the reason that they're not good at it. It's getting in the way of their health and development. When we look at anxiety disorders, we're talking about it really getting in the way of functioning for them. When we just talk about problematic anxiety, we're talking about it stopping them from that are good for them. Because again, we all have anxiety. Anxiety is good for us. We want anxiety, but there are places where it stops us from doing it away. And whether we're adults or kids, those are the places where we learn to manage it differently, so it stops getting in the way as much. They'll probably always get in the way. Some of us are just really anxious and will always be working. There are many different phases of anxiety. It can often be hard to spot, especially I would say in young boys. Anxiety can be really hard to see because it doesn't always show up in the typical ways that it would show up. Oftentimes with young boys, we see it more around aggression or anger than we see it in your typical withdrawal or avoidance of something. And so boys who are really aggressive in the classroom, don't know their boundaries, like are constantly touching other kids, don't know how to manage the volume of their voice, like stuff like that. That can all be related to anxiety. It can also be related to other stuff. That's why if your kid's really struggling with it, probably talk to a professional and allow them to kind of help you parse through exactly what's going on. But anxiety could be one of the many that could be going on. Anxiety and depression, especially as kids get older, become quite paired. And I often have kids come into my office who are struggling with depression, and the primary thing I end up working on is anxiety. The reason for that is because depression typically is a result of the world not being that rewarding anymore, which for some people, it could be because your brain isn't releasing enough of a rewarding chemical or serotonin. For some people, it's just because you're not doing enough rewarding. And it's interesting how many young people sit in front of me in my office and I say, what are you doing that makes you happy? And they become stupid and say, I'm depressed. Nothing makes me happy. It's like, okay, but what are you doing? That, like, happiness isn't really a birthright. Happiness is the way our brain responds to doing stuff that's good for us and our community. That's why we feel happy when we do stuff that's rewarding. And so you just sit back and expect to be happy, and I get that it's a lot more complex than that. But where this overlaps with anxiety is anxiety can clamp down on your life and stop you from doing those rewarding things. It can stop you from going out, from interacting with people. It can make school a living hell because you're terrified to talk to anybody. And so there's nothing rewarding happening in that place. And so depression is something that I think is quite strongly, especially with kids getting older, connected. So what can you do about it? So routine, structure, and predictability, especially for littler people, is really important. However, where I would swap this around a little bit is that for kids who constantly need routine and predictability and have a hard time managing anything unpredictable, then some of the work becomes to start helping them feel more comfortable going with the flow a little bit. In a safe way, starting to change up the routine. Telling them you're doing one thing, but doing something else that's equally awesome, just so that they get used to being able to manage some of the slight variations in life. That's specifically for those kids who just need everything to be predictable. The anxiety that you're helping them overcome is related to the predictability, which means you're going to have to face it, which is good. Next thing is sleep, helping kids sleep better. And this is could be the topic of a whole other conversation because sleep is such a huge deal. But some of the basics that you can do to help kids sleep better is keep their bedtime routine, keep them really consistent, because one of the driving factors of falling asleep for kids is this circadian rhythm, which is this pattern behavior day after day after day. As kids move into teenage years and that circadian rhythm wants to slip back, anytime that bedtime falls back a couple hours, the brain is like, sweet, that's way better. It becomes really hard then for that brain to move forward. So if you can keep it more consistent for them, you'll help them get a better sleep. I'm sure you've all heard talks about electronics before bedtime. Electronics are a mess for sleep for a couple of reasons. The first has to do with light cycles, which are responsible for setting those circadian rhythms. So as those lights are blinking from the phone, it essentially is kind of resetting that circadian clock a little bit because the brain's like, oh, I guess there's still light out. Probably shouldn't fall asleep quite yet because historically our brain set some of those rhythms based on light and temperature, which leads me to the next thing with sleep is changing temperature for kids. But I'll go back to electronics because again, as they move into their teenage years, there's so much arousal related to social interaction and social judging that it takes their brain quite a while to slow down after they've been using social media. Just clicking through people, that's quite stimulating for the brain, and sleep requires you to calm down, to slow down, to lower that arousal level, and that's really hard to do. So two reasons is that excitement from it, the arousal piece. That goes the same for video games for kids, and you'll know your kid best. You'll know how long it takes them to chill out after they've played whatever it is they're playing. For some kids, it can be just not on school nights, man, because it takes them so long to get it out of their heads. The kids who are still buzzing, talking about the game constantly, like sometimes just being aware of that arousal piece is it's constantly going to make it harder for them. So being aware of digital media, I mentioned temperature. This is something that's showing up in a lot of modern research, is that our brains initially paired sleep to what was going on in our environment in the last 250,000 years, and we typically slept outside, and so it was a little bit cooler when we slept, and so the brains learned to pair that, and so if we can cool things down slightly at night, it makes it easier for the brain to fall asleep. And so 18 degrees is said to be like the optimal temperature, and for kids who like really overdress for bed in these giant fluffy onesies, like I'd recommend switching that so they can cool down easier as they're sleeping. Like they may fall asleep quick because they're cozy and safe and comfy, but then maintaining a good sleep through the night is going to be harder if they can't pop a leg up the sheet or whatever to start cooling down. Other stuff with sleep, just trying to think of some other stuff. Yeah, if anything comes to me, I'll try to add it. I gave a talk to your kids on sleep, though, which you're also welcome to. If that interests anyone, you can have the slides for that too, which is tips on sleep. Diet can be really influential on anxiety. I talked to the kids about caffeine already. You're welcome. The reason I do that as it relates to sleep is something called an adenosine blocker, and what adenosine is sleep works based on circadian rhythms and sleep pressure. And sleep pressure is every moment your body's breaking down energy, a chemical called adenosine is being. And that adenosine builds up throughout the day, and then it gets to this overflowing point in the body, and your brain starts to feel really tired. It's actually the sleep pressure from this buildup of adenosine that means you start closing your eyes and yawning. That's all related to that. And so caffeine blocks the response of adenosine, which is why so many of us love it, because it's like, I'm not sleepy at all anymore. That was wonderful. We need to be really mindful of it, though, because caffeine has a 7-hour half-life, and what that means is it takes 7 hours to break down half the caffeine in our body. So if a kid who can't manage as much caffeine, because they're not as hooked as most adults are over the years, but if they have something with caffeine in it at like 5 or 6 at night, half of that caffeine is still going to be there till like midnight, which is crazy when you think about how that's going to impact your sleep. So something to pay attention to related to sleep stuff like dense sugars and that are also going to impact it. When we talk about anxiety, we're talking about arousal typically in that engine, stuff like sugars, carbohydrates, those are all going to fuel that a little bit more. And so keeping kids on a pretty balanced diet, which I know is hard because once they get into teenage years, they're like, give me all the brown foods, like all the carbs you can find, that's all I ever want to eat for the rest of my life. It seems to be kind of when teenagers are driven to work, so it's really hard. Physical activity is really important also for managing anxiety because it helps us learn to ramp up our body and slow down our body. So these are kind of the basics. Here are the specific stuff with anxiety. Number one is we have to help kids face their fear. The number one thing that makes anxiety worse for kids is avoidance. Avoidance increases anxiety for kids over time. And the reason for this is again, because his brain is very patterned, and let's say a kid walks into a situation and the brain says, oh my gosh, I can't handle this, I need to get out of here, this feels so crappy right now. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, bud, well, you've had a busy week, so just take a day off of school. And now their brain says, oh man, this feels so much better not having to go to that thing. We were totally right to be scared of it. And then next time they approach it, there's an even stronger response because their brain's now linked not doing the thing to feeling a lot better. And so when we help kids avoid stuff, we're actually increasing their anxiety. So the number one way to help kids get over their anxiety is to safely build them up towards facing stuff. I talk about it as you've just got to be moving forward. And so kids who are facing a really overwhelming fear, they may not do it in one step. It may take them many steps as long as they're moving forward, right? Like kids who can't sleep without a parent like right next to them or whatever. It might not be that you're locking the door and listening to them scream forever. It could be that you're like, okay, well tonight I'm going to sit at your door for 20 minutes, tomorrow night I'm going to sit there for a couple nights down the road, I'm going to sit there for 10 minutes, then I'm going to sit here down the hall. Like you're constantly moving them a little forward and facing their anxiety without fully doing common avoidance routine. This is also when kids get older, this is where that talk, which I know I'm in DC, and I often get really looks around this, but when I talk about pot is a bit of a problem related to this in that teenagers will always tell me, oh man, but it's the only way I can calm down. And absolutely, in the moment for a lot of people, pot is a drug of disconnection. It helps disconnect people from their experience, which feels pretty pleasant in that moment to just kind of float away from it. The problem is it's also avoidance, which is why when we look at pot use over time as it relates to anxiety, anxiety slowly increases over time. And that's really a really well substantiated research finding that we have now, is that over time, anxiety will increase. And so if you're working with a kid who's struggling with pot use, I always talk to kids about pot vacations. Like, let the world suck for a few days. It's going to be overwhelming because you don't want them to start using really early and then get to like 16 or 17 and now trying to go through a day without pot. The world just absolutely smushes them. And so helping kids start to manage that world a little bit without it. Or just keep them. It's okay too. Be mindful and teach mindfulness. Breathing is one of the ones that I always find the funniest in my work because it's like, it really is one of the best ways to manage anxiety, but it's also like the worst used across all of our strategies ever. Like if you were to think back in your life to every time anyone has ever told you to just breathe, like has there ever been a time where you've been like, thank you so much, my breathing was a little bit high and unregulated, I've now adjusted it, I appreciate your feedback, very helpful, right? Probably not, right? And the same is true for kids. When we're freaking out, we don't do anything new. And for a lot of people, breathing in a way that's healthy, like at best what you get from kids when you tell them to just breathe is they continue to breathe really poorly, just with more energy. They're like, I am breathing enough, right? And they're just like hyperventilating and making it worse for themselves. Because to actually breathe in a way that calms down anxiety, which I'll show you in a second, takes a bit of practice. And we don't do new things when we're freaking out. Like, what do you do when you're freaking out? Like, for all the people that are like, I'm going to start doing yoga when I freak out, or whatever. Like, when you get to that place where you actually are freaking out, are you like, oh yeah, I got that yoga DVD, I'm going to go put that in right now. Like, typically you'll go to the things that have always been safe and comfortable. You'll wear like your Snuggie and watch Full House and eat the same salty chip you ate when you were a kid or whatever. You go to the things you've always done. And so it takes work to walk that new pathway into the brain. And breathing is the exact same. When we're teaching kids to breathe, we're not just throwing it at them as a tool that they're using when they're losing it. We're teaching them to breathe when they're calm, and then it's going to help them. And they might get to the place where they can start using it when they're freaking out. And even if they don't, they know how to breathe better, and it'll stop them from getting to the place where they're freaking out. So, this is going to be hard to do with the mic, so I'm going to put this down and try to talk really loud for a second. So I want you to try to put a hand on your chest and a hand on your stomach. We're getting there. I'll figure this technology thing out. Hand on your chest, hand on your stomach, and just breathe normally. I had all the other people do this today. It was funny watching them because for a lot of you, if you pay attention to what hand is moving the most, it might be the hand chest, right? And if that's the case, you should practice breathing. Because there's a lot of research that shows that most people are breathing too high up in their chest and too rapidly. And the way that we breathe to calm down is for you to try to stop this hand from moving. As you're breathing in, push the hand on your stomach out, and as you exhale, and the whole time try to keep the hand on your chest still. And that's going to push the air right down into the bottom of your belly. If you're more comfortable with it, there's lots of yoga practices. It's a yoga nidra that's breathing, and you want to be really into yoga. But there are some good practices to teach you. But the goal of breathing to calm down is to slow our breathing and breathe deeper. And so when we're teaching kids to breathe, it's good to teach them to do this around bedtime if they're not too freaked out around bedtime, because it also just helps kids calm, and it's a really easy place for them to learn while they're just laying on their back watching their hands move. For any new habit, it usually takes 2 or 3 weeks of consistent practice to be able to lock it in. And so I would recommend teaching your kids to breathe. With little kids, you can make a game out of it, of like putting a stuffed animal on their chest and one on their stomach. You can say, give the one on your tummy a ride, and the one on your chest needs to sleep, so try not to lose it. Right? So you can play different games with it to teach kids how to breathe. But it's one of the most important skills that we learn, because when you're staring at that bear, the very first thing that shifts is your breath. Your breath starts going really quick, and that works like a bellow to fuel that fire and to speed up that whole process. Like if you can stop the breathing, you can sometimes, like if you can slow that breathing and keep it calm, you can sometimes derail that huge anxiety response before it gets out of control. So I highly recommend teaching kids to breathe. I also recommend mindfulness stuff. And yeah, I know mindfulness has all sorts of different, like I know it's written all over expensive yoga bottles and whatever, but when I'm talking about mindfulness, I'm talking about helping kids to be in their body in the moment. And there's lots of sneaky ways we do this. With my son, whenever I noticed he was starting to work himself up, because he was a kid who just kind of chewed up the world in giant bites at a time, and so when I noticed he'd start to get a little frazzled and his face would turn red, we'd have staring contests. And it was a really good way to settle him quite quickly, because that's mindfulness. When you're having a staring contest, all you're doing is focusing on what's going on. The easiest one, though, I think, for kids, and this comes from the 5-4-3-2-1 that's often used in trauma work, but with kids I find it's easier. We can do this right now, so I'll stop talking, and I want you to, when I stop talking, just try to pick up 5 sounds in the room. Don't tell anyone, just try to pick them up. And as you're trying to do it, what do you notice happening in your body? For a lot of you, you'll probably notice your body slows down a little. And that's grounding. That's what grounding does. That's something that I've used a lot when I work with a number of professional athletes, like free skiers or mountain bikers, and teaching them to control their breathing helps them perform better in those situations, because they learn to manage. There's some benefits to anxiety sometimes in those sports if you don't think about risk. You're willing to just give her, which some of them really like. The challenge is your coordination sucks, your memory sucks. There's all sorts of stuff that get them in problems in their race runs or whatever. So teaching people to breathe and to do mindfulness, like that grounding, is really important. It's also something I talk to avalanche first responders, because we know that when we train people to do a thing, it's different than when you have to do the thing. The body starts to have that response in a really stressful situation. Having a really quick way to start slowing your body down before you do it helps. So grounding, I think, is a really good trick for that. So help children explore their emotional experiences. We don't do this in the moment when kids are freaking out. We do this afterwards. We let it go in the moment, because if you try to talk to somebody when they're freaking out, well, we really need to talk about how you're behaving right now. I mean, we've already covered how kids are going to respond. This is the type of thing that we gently try to get them to hold that marble for a moment. Remember that metaphor? We gently try to get them to hold that marble for a moment after they've calmed down. Right? We say, hey, you were really upset about that last night. Do you remember what was going on for you? We just dig at it a little bit. We don't sit with it too long. We don't pressure it too much. We just let them know it's something that's safe to talk about. We don't mention it in a blaming way. We don't say, like, hey, you don't think you're big. What you did last night, totally not okay. Don't ever want to see that again. We get a lot more out of it. If we're like, well, last night seemed like it was really hard for you. Do you remember what was going on? Like, when did you first start feeling like you were losing it? Because that was like a really tough moment. When we approach it like that, I find we get a lot more conversation with kids. Help them feel safe in it. Help them feel that their response, that you can understand that it might have come from somewhere different, and it's not them in a way that's really not that blaming. Especially for little kids, there's this idea of creating a secure base. It's one of the healthiest ways to promote anxiety. And what I mean by this is not just, this comes from attachment research and attachment literature, which I know over the years when I've presented attachment, because it was one of my first loves in research and in schooling, was attachment stuff. And when I've talked about it in the past, I always get this, well, I'm not going to breastfeed my kid. Fair enough, that's not what attachment's about. Attachment is about, as a parent, being a secure base to kids, which means that we push them to experience things in the world. This is this exposure piece, and then we're safe for them to return to. And I think there are issues when, as a parent, it's hard for us to do either of those things. Like if we're not pushing kids out into the world enough, their anxiety is going to increase and increase over time. And if we're not somebody that they feel safe coming to when they're overwhelmed, then it becomes a real struggle for them to learn how to safely navigate their feelings and to feel okay about themselves and their responses in the world. And so if that's something you want to look into a little bit more, I really like the Circle of Security program. I think it's based on really good research. I know there's a bunch of different facilitators for the Circle of Security, and some of them presented a little bit differently, but at its core, I think Circle of Security is really good and really builds off some of the best early research and attachment and parenting sort of solutions stuff. So I'd recommend that, but I think just general, keeping that philosophy in mind, that the goal is to push kids out to explore the world and then be safe to welcome them back and help them regroup, recover, and then go back out. Be arousal aware. And so when I talk about arousal aware, what I'm talking about is start guessing where your kid's at with that internal engine metaphor that I used before. Because knowing that, for example, if you've got a kiddo who gets super worked up related to digital media and they're nervous about going to an event, letting them use digital media before that event is going to make it really hard for them. Like if going to school is something that's really hard for them and you're like, all right, we'll just use the phone for 10 minutes, you'll calm them down, or it'll look like they're calming down when they're staring at the phone, but it's actually going to make their anxiety worse when they go into that thing. And just be aware of that, even around stuff like bedtime. Like if the energy is really high in the house, take time to slow that energy down for kids, and it's going to help with that anxiety. Because so much of what kids experience as anxiety is just this huge energy that needs direction, and then it ends up sitting on one of these things. These are these crazy conversations you have with kids at bedtime sometimes, because their system's worked up because they're alone in the dark. And so their system's naturally worked up, and so they start bringing up all these things in the world that suck for them. And you're like, what? Where did that come from? We've never heard about that ever before, right? And that's related to that arousal system, because kids don't always make the best guess of where they're coming from. Just aware of the time. There's a few other things I want to talk about, like this. What do we do when kids freak out? Because again, the brain works totally different when somebody's freaking out. And as that example before of, trying to talk somebody out of being scared when they're staring at a bear, you're not going to have great outcomes. So that strategy that might work when you're calm, hey, let's talk about your not as helpful in that moment when people are freaking out. So here's what I recommend. The first is, and I use this metaphor calm, the first is to change or control the stimulation, and usually it means reducing the stimulation as much as you can here. So if there's lots of electronics on, kids are running around, stuff is going on, the more you can do to reduce that stimulation, the sooner somebody's going to calm down. Again, imagine you're in that scenario with the bear. Like, how hard would it be for you to calm down after that bear left if you're just constantly hearing branches snapping and stuff running around in the periphery? Even though it's maybe not a bear, just that stimulation is enough to keep things buzzing in your brain. It's like when you're walking at night and you're startled, and then your whole brain changes and you're all of a sudden like transfixed on every sound or shadow in the environment. When we're overwhelmed, stimulation, especially in our periphery, becomes really powerfully something that we're really aware of, right? And this has to do with the system that's trying to keep us safe, right? If you were being chased by some animal, you'd want to be really aware now of all the other potential threats that could kill you. And so when we're helping kids calm down when they're freaking out, the first thing we want to do is try to reduce that stimulation as much as we can. We want to allow time, because again, once their system's shifted, we're talking about a change in blood flow, we're talking about a change in hormones, we're talking about a whole different way in which their body's working. Like it's not like it was on Full House, where like kid will be freaking out and the dad will say something perfect and the kid will be like, gosh, Dad, I never thought of it that way, I'm so calm now. Like that's really not how the real world works. Once somebody's overwhelmed, there's a shift in how their brain and body are working in that environment. and it's going to take a little bit of time for that to settle. So your goal is to create a safe place for them to calm down, not necessarily for them just to, they're calming. You just want to create the setting for them to be able to calm and recognize that it's going to take a bit of time, which I think can take a little bit of weight off the parents sometimes. If we're like, oh my gosh, how do I get this back under control? It's nice to be like, they're freaking out. I can't stop them from freaking out right now. I can keep them safe. I can be available for them, but they're probably still going to freak out for a little bit longer. Less talk in those moments. Oftentimes, we just keep talking, which again, in my example of the bear, often makes things worse. We usually don't talk kids out of freedom. Really, we want to give really bold messages of, look, I'm here for you if you need anything, I care about you, let me know if I can do anything to support you, and then giving them their space. And sometimes staying near them while they're freaking out, because I know some kids, especially if they're freaking out and you're like, I can't even be around this right now, and you go somewhere else, they'll like chase you around. Even the kids who are like, get out of my room, and then you like leave the room and they start kicking the door or slamming the door, and you're like, you told me to leave. You're obviously doing that to get me to re-engage. And it's like, what are you asking for? So sometimes being available, but not being in their face is a really good way to manage that. I worked with this foster parent once. We had a kid who was doing that, but they were becoming so violent, it was becoming unsafe for the foster parent. So we had them cut a door, like a barn door, to the kid's room, so that when the kid was freaking out, they had a door between them, but they could still look over the door and be like, I'm here. Because that needs that attachment need. If you're there for them, but you're also there for them. Movement. If we can keep kids moving along when they're freaking out, sometimes we can help them calm down quicker. Sometimes if it's related to stimulation, and if they're just buzzing around, then we're going to slow that movement. But let's say, they're freaking out because they always have to get up early and do whatever it is they have to do on Saturday. We can just keep them slowly moving towards the thing rather than go to an all-out stop. We can usually have a better outcome with it. And people will work through stuff better when they're moving, because in those moments we're freaking out, our bodies are designed to move. Everything it's trying to do in that moment is to move. So I'm aware of time, so I'll skip through some of this. I think a lot of the stuff around COVID and anxiety, we've seen play out in society a little different. I think kids are getting pretty wise to a lot of it. Some of the places that I'd say are really important to still focus on is this negativity bias. It's a lot right now to stay on media and to be aware of everything going on. Like, it is draining, and our brains really focus on negatives. They will stick on negatives far more than they'll stick on positives. And so I think when there's so much going on in the world right now, remaining informed, but at the same time just shutting it off for a bit can be really helpful for kids and families too. Of like, okay, we're getting the right information on this, but we don't need to constantly be reading this whole thread on Facebook about which side of whatever debate sucks currently. We can just shut those things off, and it's going to help our brains and our anxiety a little. And that's not about putting your head in the sand. It's about being informed, but also be aware that you don't need to be constantly checking, because that anything is going to have a negative. So be aware of that. I think talking to kids openly about it, asking them what their thoughts are on it, what their views on that can go a long way to managing some of that anxiety too. I think oftentimes we kind of try to have the conversation based on where we think their anxiety is, rather than just sitting with them and saying, what are your fears about everything going on right now, right? And sometimes we find that kids' fears are dramatically different than ours. I remember at the first part of right when COVID became a thing, a lot of the stuff I was hearing from kids were like, so what do you think about it? And they were telling me stuff like, well, I'm just really worried that I'm not going to be able to go to the cabin this summer with my own. Like, those were the kind of things that they were looking at rather than this bigger debate around it. So being really safe and open with kids about, hey, tell me what you're thinking about it, I think is a really good way to manage that. If kids are taken away, pay attention to kids being pulled from things that are rewarding from them, and do your best to replace rewarding stuff for them. I know initially when stuff started, we were seeing huge rates of depression because all the stuff that kids found value in. And remember, kids are just desperately looking for identity, and so some of their identity was so rooted in these things that they were doing, and then all of a sudden they're not playing hockey, or they're not playing soccer. And so a kid who's like, I am hockey, right? Which is totally most like 11 to 14-year-olds who play hockey are like, my whole world is hockey. When you took that away from them for that time, That would have been really tough if everything they thought about themselves no longer existed for them in that moment. And so being aware of those places where your kids may have lost stuff that's rewarding to them, and that's also going to impact how you. So I do want to get to, we've already kind of talked about this, where caffeine is essentially like a starter kit for anxiety. It ramps up our nervous system. So be aware of that. Pot avoidance, digital media is going to ramp up arousal, which is going to, again, be a bit like a starter kit for anxiety. If somebody's going into a situation where they're going to be anxious, caffeine, video games, digital media, all of those are going to rev up that engine and make them experience anxiety more powerful in those situations, so be aware. This one is what I wanted to get to. So with suicide, again, when kids are overwhelmed, the brain will move through that response we talked about earlier. And sometimes when kids get to that fight response, they don't really give anything to fight. And especially we see this in young girls, where we see this internalized anger a lot more than an externalized anger. And so sometimes the I hate you feeling isn't an I hate you or I hate anyone feeling. It comes out as I hate myself, I hate my life, I wish I were never born, right? And parents hear this oftentimes from kids in those moments where they're totally overwhelmed. And so what I would say in those moments with your kids is do your best to sit with them, help them calm down. Try not to, I know oftentimes we are so scared by it, so check our own response in that moment, because it's the most terrifying thing in the world for a parent to hear. And sometimes we respond in ways that make it worse, because we're like, how could you say that? I give you so much, I can't believe you're saying something. Right? And that comes from our own fear and our own response to it. So check your own feelings around it. And then once they've calmed down, ask them very direct questions. Have you had thoughts of suicide? Have you thought about how you would kill yourself? And I know these sound like totally overwhelming questions, so they're things that you got to sit with and think about. But I promise you, helping kids feel safer talking about suicide is the #1 prevention strategy for it. I want to tell kids that sometimes you're going to have these thoughts through life. We can talk about them. And we know that kids who talk about suicide are far, 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 far more likely to not attempt to kill. It is, again, the #1 prevention strategy is letting kids know it is safe to talk about their feelings with us. If they do say, yeah, I'm feeling really down and I'm having these thoughts regularly, then connect them with professionals. If there's nobody at the moment that they can connect to, there's some really good services like Kids Help Phone Text Line, which I was really lucky enough to help start nationwide, which is an amazing service where kids can text in and text with a counselor at any time of day, which is really cool because talking to somebody on the phone is quite anxiety provoking and overwhelming, and kids who are overwhelmed often don't want to talk to somebody on a phone, but they will sometimes text. It's a little bit easier for them, so I highly recommend that. I know I'm pretty low out of time, and I wanted to leave a few moments for questions, which there aren't that many, but if you had any other questions that I'm not able to answer, feel free to shoot me an email, and again, you're welcome to my slides, which I will send. So, any questions? A lot of info ahead. Yes?
Weighted blankets?
Yeah. Yeah, I love weighted blankets. I mean, before COVID, I had one in my office. That was great for kids. I mean, that's one of those things that this is part of learning that recipe for an individual child of what helps them wrap up and what helps them calm down. And for some kids, pressure, therapeutic pressure, which is like what a weighted blanket can offer, can be really good at helping them calm down. There's some kids who just want to feel that pressure when they're overwhelmed. So yeah, absolutely. I don't think they're a cure-all for everything. I think it's about learning about what stuff works for your kids. I recommend parents, sometimes you can go through and have activity nights where you kind of create the recipe for your kid of what helps them calm down. You can kind of move through the different senses and figure out, well, what music helps speed up your system or make you feel faster? What music helps slow it down? Or what taste helps speed it up and slow it down, right? Or smells are a really interesting one for kids to help calm them down. I remember when I was working in an inpatient unit in a hospital with kids, we'd always run through little programs like this of trying to help kids learn what calms them down. And there was this one little guy who really liked the smell of sandalwood. He you start to see him get overwhelmed, and you pull out this little smelling stone and then put it back in his pocket. It seemed to really help chill him out. So I think get creative with it and learn what speeds up your kid's system that's being arousal aware, right? Like learn what speeds it up and what slows it down, because it's going to be a little bit different for everyone. Adele might be too slow. Like that really works. But Eminem might be too much. It's just aggressive. Right? And SoundCloud's just probably not big for him. Yes.
So there are kids, one kid who asked to get off the screen. Yeah, okay, no problem. And the other one fights, argues. How do you stop that from happening?
Well, this is tough, right? Because kids are like, but it's not fair. Kids have this idea that the world needs to be totally fair. Like, they got 6 and I got 5.99999999999. Right? That's how kids are. And so it's kind of a no-win scenario, but you do need to be mindful, especially of the one who's struggling most sometimes, and especially if it's like the older who's struggling. Like this is hard too, because sometimes you can play the card of, well, they're older, so we allow them a little bit different rules. But if the older one's struggling, that becomes really hard. But I think you have to start having those discussions of, you know, we make decisions to support. And that's what it feels like. This is a struggle for. So we're going to work on it this way. What I would recommend with kids who are blowing up related to social media is, rather than being like, you're not allowed social media, what you can do is give them the same amount of time, but space it differently. And so what I would recommend is give them frequent opportunities to use it, but decrease the duration of those and the intensity of it. So if they're being given, say, 30 minutes or an hour, rather than just giving them, okay, go take your hour, you give them 10 minutes, and then get them to do something calming in between, and then give them another 10. And that way you're actually using digital media as a way to build their capacity to manage hyperarousal. And then you could also argue, well, you're not losing any time, we're just spacing it differently. And that way then, if you were to look at that arousal, if they were sitting on it for an hour, it would just go like this and like this and like this, versus if you're giving it to them in smaller doses, it just kind of goes like this. And it never goes quite as high. So that would be another thing. Reading books is so good, like the best. Like if you can read books and continue to read books with your kids, like keep doing it as long as kids will let you do it. I remember working in inpatient mental health, and like these super like bitter-hardened teens, like we read to them or sing to them, and it's so funny because at first they're like, this is the dumbest, and then like within a week or two of falling into the pattern, like they crave it and they want it because it starts to feel so safe. So I hugely recommend reading books. When you first started your question, I thought you were going to ask if I have any book recommendations, which I often get asked you. And then if you like reading, there is a book that just came out this year that I absolutely love from the SPACE program, which is a Stanford anxiety program, but I think it's called Breaking the Bonds of Anxiety and OCD. But I can email that to Denise as well if anyone's interested. It's one of the best books on anxiety I've read in years for parents that totally replaces all the books I used to recommend parents. The program itself, the SPACE program, anything they're producing is amazing. So good. Yeah. Oh yeah, and sorry. So kids reading, but also we have those kids who will just keep reading. So at some point it's going to reach its calming limit, and so you do have to set boundaries on it. And like a natural stop point for a lot of kids is, okay, you finish your chapter and do whatever, and then head to bed. But I also recommend, like for kids who are laying in bed and can't fall asleep, to try for 20 minutes, get out of bed and do something calming, like draw or read at the desk or somewhere out of the bed for a few minutes, and then get back into bed and try to sleep again, because it's quite anxiety provoking to just lay in bed and feel like it's not working. And it also starts pairing the bed with anxiety for them, rather than, you try for 20 minutes, all right, head out of the bed for 5 minutes, do something calming, then head back in. You're not going to slow down them while it's speed it up. But yeah, reading before bed is a great one, drawing before bed, playing Lego before bed for young boys who sometimes don't want to read. That's a pretty chill activity for boys usually is just they let go. Be creative, slower, it's better than something to the center to that. Okay, any other thoughts, strange beliefs, folks?
How detrimental is being over transparent with your child? So like what Petra was saying, like I've got two boys. The older one is the one who like is more wanting up in the morning, so he gets up half an hour earlier than the younger. And so they're just very transparent with them, like we like to come in the morning, we like to fight in the morning. Gosh, so they're going to bed at 8 o'clock. Is that like detrimental to him by being transparent? Like, should he, or is that okay?
No, it's not like you're like attacking them with their health. Like, I like being really transparent and open with kids. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's more in the how than the what too. Like, I think as long as you're doing it in a way that's not shaming to any kids, because I have heard it done in the past of like, well, you know, your sister sucks at that, so probably not with that language, but something that kind of feels like that to the kids. So as long as you're framing it in a way that's like, that's quite respectful to the kids' needs and not making them feel shame or like they're less than how they're interacting with the world. No, I think being open and transparent in everything with kids is usually the best strategy. Usually the worst referrals sometimes I get from parents in my other job is when parents are like, we've got this huge secret that we have, like they're adopted and they're 16, how do we tell them? And it's like, what? Yeah. The worst is like, you should have just been open from the start. Like, God. Yeah, transparency, I think, with kids is usually pretty good. Because the risk of not being transparent with kids is that their brains are still developing and they're going to guess at putting the pieces together. Like, because what we often see is parents will try to save their kids from the truth of it, especially in like families that are separated or whatever. So, well, why can't I hang out with dads as much? And they're like, well, dad's doing some stuff that's unsafe in the past. And then like you leave it at that, and then kids will run through the Rolodex of like, well, what does unsafe mean? And like, for kids, like, my dad's robbed banks. It's like, no, he let you stay up too late. God. Right? So kids will be creative and try to put those pieces together sometimes and do it in a worse way than we will. This also goes for talking to kids sexuality. Is if we're not teaching them, there are a lot of places where they're going to learn it, and the information that they're getting is probably not going to be ideal, especially if their other bonehead 11-year-old friends are the ones being like, well, this is totally what happened. It's like, that's not how we want our kids learning about something that could be a very valuable and rewarding part of their life. Any other questions?
Do you ever come across kids who not necessarily experience anxiety, but tricking themselves into believing they're experiencing anxiety? How do you
I think kids overgeneralize everything. It's just kind of the nature of kids. And also kids, like, I think because they're desperately looking to figure out who they are in the world, it's very hard for them to be like, I am so-and-so who doesn't also experience anxiety. It's like, my name is so-and-so and I am anxious, right? Like they're looking for labels or ways to identify themselves in the world, and especially sometimes when it helps them, like if they're a kid who's invisible and also struggles a little bit, to be able to then go to the teacher and be like, I have anxiety. Like it gives them a little bit of extra care they're drawing in. I think this is happening not just with anxiety, but with all sorts of stuff. I hear kids all the time. I know in our community right now, gender is a huge discussion, and we're hearing a lot of it from kids. And what I constantly tell families who are worried about it too is that the biggest risks related to these things, honestly, when you look at all the research in it, is not feeling supported and safe at home. And so I think for parents to just roll with it, and like you're not overly buying in, but you say to me, like, well, what ways can I help you? Tell me what that means to you, and you're open and accepting of it. It helps them feel like, even, like, you know, I like rap music. When I was young, my parents hated rap music. And they were very open to that. And I felt very guilty about listening to rap music for a long time. And I know that's a silly metaphor, but kids take on these things, and they look at our responses, and sometimes they think they're saying rap music sucks, and then I'm going to hear that because I should be listening to whatever Phil Collins that they were listening to. But what oftentimes kids hear is that I don't know how to identify myself, or I don't know what I am or what I think, and it starts making them feel less about themselves as a whole rather than just. So I think, if kids are over-identifying with the thing, rather than try to argue them out of it, just sit with it and allow them to experience it in a safe way, and eventually they'll probably figure it out. And again, as long as they're not using it, because I do hear a lot of kids are like, well, I can't go to gym class because I'll have anxiety. Like if that's the case, it's good for them to go to gym class. So we're going to say, yeah, and I'm here to help you with your anxiety, but you also need to stay. Answer that. Went into a whole tangent like that. Anything else? Is that good? Great.
Well, I'm sure you're feeling like me. I could listen to Sean talk for a long time. It's almost been 2 hours and it doesn't feel like it at all. So I just want to have you join in with me to thank Sean. So let's just give him that. And just so you know, our PAC paid for part of this presentation and also the district. So just so you know, it was kind of a joint effort. So it was great to be able to bring Sean here. I will put the PDF of this presentation and the one that we're showing at school on sleep because there's tons of good information in that too. I'll put it on our website, and if I can get the recording on there, I'll do that too. So by next week, all of that should be available for you, okay? So again, Sean, thanks so much. So much wisdom. Thank you. And have a safe drive home.